Cerbos Hub, what is it and how does it work? Hey, Alex here from Cerbos, and in this video we're going to do a bit of a run through of how Cerbos Hub works in conjunction with Cerbos Policy Decision Points, the open source project, to give you a complete managed authorization solution. So to do this, we're actually going to look at the request lifecycle, and it all obviously starts with the end client. So this could be a web app, it could be a mobile app, it could be some sort of API client that you issue, but ultimately there are users interacting with your system. And for start with, we're going to look at kind of the API flow, so the backend flow that your application client will be calling inside of your backend to actually perform actions. So the request comes in from your client, goes through your API gateway, and ultimately lands inside of your application service. Now, your application could be a load of microservices, could be a monolith, could be a pile of serverless functions. It's kind of agnostic. Cerbos is agnostic to any particular architecture. But ultimately, that request comes in, and there's going to be some sort of request handler which is going to handle that request. Now, on that request, you know really two things. That request is probably going to be authenticated, so you know who the user is that's making the request, or the identity that's making the request. And then you can go out to your identity provider or your own application database to go and fetch further attributes about that particular user, what roles they have, what team they're in, what memberships they have, that kind of further information that's relevant for authorization. And you also know on that request what resource and action they're trying to perform. So they're trying to get a report, they're trying to view a purchase order, they're trying to approve an expense, these kind of things. And these are really the entities inside of your application that users interact with. And the actions can be your usual create, read, update, delete, but you can actually be far more expressive with Cerbos policy and actually have things like the higher level business goals. So approve, deny, flag, comment, download, whatever's kind of relevant based on the resources that the user is interacting with. Now, based on those two bits of information, the user and the resource, you would then typically have a load of if-else case switch style logic to determine exactly how that user should proceed or that request should proceed, whether it should be approved or denied or allowed or denied for that particular action. Now, with Cerbos, this is where you decouple that authorization logic into a standalone service. So Cerbos PDP, Cerbos Policy Decision Points, is the open source project which you would then deploy and run inside of your application architecture. So Cerbos decision points are running inside of your infrastructure. It could be inside your cluster. It could be a service or a sidecar. It could be running as just another microservice inside of your deployment. It could be just running bare metal on a VM. It could be running in a serverless function even. Cerbos Policy Decision Points are ultimately responsible for taking input of principal, resource, and action, and then evaluating policy and returning a decision of whether an action should be allowed or denied, or whether there should be some query criteria if you want to, say, filter a database query based on what a user has access to. Now, Cerbos Policy Decision Points, in a typical application, you're going to have many of these running inside of your system. Especially if you're running something like a Kubernetes sidecar, you're going to have one instance of the Cerbos Policy Decision Point per instance of your service. So you're going to have a large number of these as your system scales up, as your system grows. And this is really where Cerbos Hub comes in. So these Cerbos Policy Decision Points need to have loaded into them policy. And rather than each policy decision point independently loading its policy in from some sort of policy store, you instead connect your Cerbos Policy Decision Points to Cerbos Hub. So Cerbos Hub is the management control plane system that is a managed service that we have released and acts really as the central place for all your policy decision points to connect to go and fetch policies from. So Cerbos Hub primarily is a CI/CD pipeline that's connected to your existing policy store. So a GitHub repository contains your Cerbos policies. Your Cerbos policies are YAML definitions of your different authorization logic. So you'd have a policy for each resource kind inside of your system, and then those policies also define the different actions that users can do upon them and under which conditions. So you must have a role or a certain attribute, must have a certain value. You can get very expressive with those conditions. And they sit in your GitHub repository. So now whenever you iterate and change or your authorization policies in that repo, Cerbos Hub is connected to that repository. So that change comes in, Cerbos Hub will firstly run all the tests that you have defined. So Cerbos, you can actually write test suites against your authorization logic. Cerbos Hub will compile and test all your policies. And should those tests pass, it will then, in a coordinated manner, update all the connected Cerbos policy decision points that are running inside of your infrastructure. Additionally, inside of Cerbos Hub, we give you tools to actually collaborate and iterate on policies directly. So that through the playground and the collaborative playground as part of Cerbos Hub, you can actually test and iterate on policy, prototype, and get real-time feedback around how your tests are passed, how a particular change would impact your authorization logic in an IDE environment that is fully hosted as part of Cerbos Hub. And again, when you're happy with those changes, you can save that. Those policies that are in your repo, the CI/CD pipeline kicks off again, and those policy updates get pushed out in a coordinated manner to all the connected policy decision points. So ultimately, this means all the policy decision points inside of your architecture are always going to be up to date with the latest set of authorization policies, and will always be serving based on the latest decisioning and basic policies you defined. So going back to our application requests flow, Cerbos then replies back inside to your application code where you've asked it, can this principal do this action on this resource? Inside your application code, where before you had lots of complicated logic, it's now a simple if statement. If Cerbos says allow, do the action. If Cerbos says deny, return some sort of error, and maybe you have some policy output definition for context for why a policy decision has been made, and the response then goes back, and ultimately you now have your client, which is getting the response whether an action should be allowed or not. So that's how at the core of the Cerbos Hub and Cerbos PDP pipeline works with kind of backend services. But now what about when you want to do authorization decisions sort of at edge or even on the client? Exclusively as part of Cerbos Hub, we have introduced the concept of a Cerbos embedded policy decision point, and this is all powered by WebAssembly. So the way this works, in the same way your Cerbos Hub CI/CD pipeline was compiling and building policies and pushing them to the Cerbos policy decision point services running in your backend, whenever the policies are pushed, Cerbos Hub runs your pipeline, runs your tests, and then also produces a secondary output, which is a Cerbos Hub embedded policy decision point, which ultimately is a WebAssembly module. So this WebAssembly module, due to the nature of being WebAssembly, can basically run anywhere. Cerbos Hub will push these to a CDN, and then you can load these into a number of different places. So firstly, you can pull them in directly to the client. So if you're in a web browser, you can pull down that WebAssembly module and start evaluating authorization decisions on device. You can additionally pull them into things like serverless functions. These are kind of short-lived in environments where you can't necessarily run a long-running service. So things like Netlify functions, Vercel functions as well, run it in Lambda functions. You have a vast number of options where you want to run this version of a policy decision point. And really the use case for these embedded policy decision points is when you want to sort of conditionally show or hide components on the page based on results you already have. So let's say you have a form where a user can interact with some resource inside of your system. You've hit the backend, so you've done the request flow, it's gone to the backend, that backend request has fetched the data from the database, it's checked with the backend deployed Cerbos policy decision point that user can view or access that particular resource. So you got the data back onto the client, but now you just simply want to show or hide menu buttons, or you want to disable edit functionality if they don't have edit access. You don't want to have to do a round trip to your backend every single time for checking whether you can do these more fine-grained permissions once the resource is kind of loaded onto the client. So using the exact same API that your client is working with, using the Cerbos SDK, you can now actually do those checks on device or in something like an edge function, which evaluates the policies, the exact same policies the backend's using, but through this WebAssembly module. And that way you will get a decision for each of those actions that you defined. And then you can say conditionally show buttons or hide menu items or disable inputs and those kind of things without, again, having to do the full round trip to your backend. And all of this is powered by Cerbos Hub. Cerbos Hub is the single source of truth. Your policies are sitting in your existing GitHub repository. Cerbos Hub generates and does the testing for you, has a whole build pipeline, synchronizes the rollout to all the backend services where you're checking permissions at the API level, but then also generates a Cerbos embedded PDP powered by WebAssembly, which they're going to be evaluated at edge or on device for more client type decisioning needs. So that is Cerbos Hub and how it works and interacts with Cerbos policy decision points.